Hey BookTube, I'm ready for part 2 of the used book haul here that I've had. This part should not nearly be as long as the other one because it's a smaller stack and it's literature, so it's not me discussing why history interests me so much and being boring like that. So we'll start right away. So we'll get right into it. The first book here is the only mass market, or I think the only mass, not true. The other two books are mass market size, but this one is the collected stories of John Cheever, without the S. This won the Pulitzer Prize, and it was a huge bestseller back in the day. It's just a big fat book of his stories, mostly published in the New Yorker. It's over 800 pages, actually. And I've wanted this book for quite a while because I know Cheever as a writer. I haven't actually read any of his stuff, but I'm aware of him, and I like to have short story collections of major 20th century fictional authors. And I found a while ago. I found the that's right here. I'll pull it out right underneath here. The Library of America collected novels of John Cheever. And usually I wouldn't have bought this if it was in any other edition than a Library of America volume, because Cheever interests me a lot more as a short story writer than he does as a novelist, even though I've never actually read any of these novels before. So I'm glad to finally actually get his collected work of short stories. And I haven't actually read any of his short stories before, but now I actually have a volume of his that I can read them. I have some fictional anthologies that do include some of his work, but I'm too neglected of my short story anthologies, so now usually it's easier when it's a collected work of just one author. Usually it's easy because then I can pick around and maybe read some of their more influential or more famous stories that way. So the next book is a Penguin Classic. The only Penguin Classic that I found, well, I found quite a lot of Penguin Classics, but this is the only one that I actually wanted. And it's North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell. This is a Victorian author, and I have a few of her books already. I've never read them before, but I have Mary Barton, which is her very first novel, and then I have Wives and Daughters, which was her very last novel. It's quite a thick novel, but it was not completed. I believe she was very close to finishing it. She was probably a couple, like maybe 100 pages, give or take, away from finishing it, and it's over 600 pages as it is. But it wasn't until after I bought both of those books that I realized maybe reading her first novel, which is not one of her most influential novels, or reading her last novel, Wives and Daughters, was not the best place to start when it comes to reading Elizabeth Gaskell, because North and South, or was it Crawford or Cranford? Those are the novels that people usually discuss the most when it comes to Elizabeth Gaskell. So, and I know I can get those on my e-reader for free from Project Gutenberg, but there is something about having a nice Penguin Classic of the author with an introduction. The introduction here is, who's the introduction by? By Martin Dodsworth, and the book itself is edited by Dorothy Collin. And it's got notes, not a whole lot of notes, but it's got some notes and an introduction, so what can you go wrong with when you can get a nice cheap paperback? It's in good copy, the spine isn't cracked or anything, and it's not marked up in any way, so I can't pass that book up. So next is an anthology of plays. It is from, was it Modern Library? Yeah, Modern Library, and it's 18th century plays. So, plays from the 18th century. And the reason why I got this volume, I believe this volume is from the 50s. And it's edited with an introduction by Ricardo Quintana from the 50s. And it's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 plays. 8 plays in this little volume here. And the reason why I got this volume is because it fits very well with one of my other volumes that I found. I found another modern library edition collection or anthology of plays, and it was called the Reformation period. Restoration. My bad. Restoration. So that would be around the it'd be the period of post Shakespeare, but not quite like right after Shakespeare. It would be the period of like 1650s, or 1670s, all the way to the turn of the century, so around 1700. And so I have that collection of plays, and I thought that this would be a perfect volume to accompany that, to read right after, because and it's all just English plays, like plays from England. And the reason why that interests me is because I don't know a whole lot about the history of plays as an art form. I mean, I have a lot of the Greek tragedies and some of the Greek comedies, and I have some volumes of some of the Roman plays, like Plautus and Terence, but I don't have a whole lot of plays other than that. Other than, I think I have a volume of Jacobean, or however you pronounce it, plays from the period right after Shakespeare in a paperback. I think I showed that on a haul before. But seeing like a volume of English plays, I don't know any of these plays before, and so I see this almost as like a time piece or a period piece, because this is plays from the this was collected in the 50s, and obviously they thought that these plays were well worth reprinting. I can actually read them out here. It gives me Cato by Joseph Addison from 1713, The Tragedy of Jane Shore by Nicholas Rowe in 1714, The Conscious Lovers by Richard Steele, 1722, The Beggar's Opera by John Gay in 1728, The Tragedy of Tragedies by Henry Fielding, 1731, The London Merchant by George Lillo in 1731 as well, She Stoops to Conquer by Oliver Goldsmith in 1773. That's the only play in here that I've actually ever heard of. And then The Rivals by Richard Brinsley Sheridan in 1775. So it's a study of, it's a collection of 1700s, or plays from the 1700s in England, and then it's also got a nice introduction here by the scholar who put it together. So yeah, getting that for a good price. It goes very well with the kind of period that I'm looking into. So we're gonna go. I have 2 Oxford World Classics next. The first one is the Oxford Shakespeare volume of Henry IV, Part 2, and this one was a bit of an interesting get because they had more of these there. They had Henry IV Part 1 there, and they also had a few more of the Oxford Shakespeare in this volume, these kinds of volumes. And the reason why I love these volumes is because their introductions are usually quite long. So this here is just the introduction alone, which is almost 100 pages, and the introduction is written by a scholar. The scholar for this volume is René Weiss, and then the play comes with a ton of footnotes, as you see. So all of this, it's like that on every page. Just a ton of footnotes for the play. Yeah. So, and I want to one day have all of Shakespeare in these volumes, but I'm being very selective with which ones I buy now, and I'm saving them for books or plays of Shakespeare that I've actually read and I enjoy, or that I would like to study more. And I had to read Henry IV Part 2 I had to read Henry IV Part 2 in my Shakespeare class a few years ago, and we just skipped Henry IV Part 1. So I've never actually read that one. I've read Part 2, and it's one of the plays in that I've read of Shakespeare's for that class that actually sticks with me the most, because I believe this is the story of Hotspur and also Prince Henry and Falstaff. But Prince Henry is the son of Henry IV, and he's a bit of a playboy. He hangs out with a lot of degenerate people, and hangs out at the bar, is a drinker. He's a complete failure as a prince, as a son of the king, and but then King Henry IV is an older, much more conservative king who's facing a challenge to his kingdom by Hotspur, and then in the end, the prince ends up coming through and becomes the hero that he was always expected to be, but never was until he was pushed to do so by the threat of the kingdom. And I find that really interesting, this play really interesting, because we studied it pretty deeply, and I loved a lot of the insights that my professor had, and I actually ended up writing an essay on this play as well. And I gotta say, it's one of the Shakespeare plays that sticks with me the most that I've read so far, and I've probably read 1/3 of Shakespeare's plays at this point. Anyways, we go on to the next Oxford World's Classic, and this is The Lives of the Caesars by Suetonius, and this is a new translation by Catherine Edwards. And the reason why I picked this up is because I already have a copy of The Lives of the Caesars, but it's the Penguin Classic edition by Robert Graves, and I've heard a lot said about Robert Graves as a translator, that you might actually be getting more Robert Graves than you would be getting of Suetonius, that he adds a lot into the narrative that really isn't actually there in the text. And even in that introduction, like the volume I have only has a tiny introduction by Robert Graves, and one of the things he says in there is that instead of adding footnotes, he just inserted the information that you would need, like that would normally be in a footnote, into the actual book, or into the actual translation, which is interesting. But for my first time reading Suetonius, I'd rather read Suetonius as he is than to read Robert Graves' own bastardization of Suetonius. So this translation here is from the 90s? No, from 2000. That was when this one was published. And so I'm really glad to get another volume of Suetonius' Lives. I've never actually read it yet, but this will be the volume that I actually read. And then the Robert Graves will be an interesting way to encounter Suetonius once I've become acquainted with him a little bit more. Once I kind of know what Suetonius is about, before I get an interpretation of him through the lens of Robert Graves. And then we're on to the last two books. The last book here is the Georgics of Virgil. I'm butchering that. I just don't know how to pronounce that. But this is a translation by David Ferry. It's a bilingual edition, so if I open this up, you see on this side here we got the Latin, and on this side we got the translation. This edition, this is a book that's directly on my Western Canon reading list. This is a very influential set of poems. I believe it's just one poem, or it's a collection of poems. I'm not entirely sure about that, but all I know is that this is like Virgil's pastoral poetry, and that this was very influential in the medieval and Renaissance period, or whatever, in the sense that the idea is that the poet has to compose a poem or compose poetry about pastoral matters, so like the shepherd, natural history, those kinds of topics, like the shepherd and I'm not explaining this very well, but it's hard to explain that phenomenon, because it was very influential, I know, in the Shakespeare, pre-Shakespeare's time, and during Queen Elizabeth's time, because I know Edward Spencer followed the same course, and I believe maybe Milton did, where you write your pastoral poem or poetry first, and then you move on to this grand epic. And so Edmund Spencer did that. He wrote pastoral poetry before he wrote the Faerie Queen, and I believe Sir Philip Sidney was following in his footsteps. He wrote a pastoral, wasn't really poem, but it was a pastoral subject. It was the Arcadia, and then I believe other poets have followed in those footsteps, where it's just this conventional formula of writing your pastoral poetry before you actually move on to your grand epic. And of course, Virgil's epic is the Aeneid, right? And so I have this edition. It's not in the best shape because the spine is cracked, and there is a fair amount of pencil. Okay, not a fair amount, but there's some pencil annotation in here by the previous owner. See if I can, you can see underline right there. And there is a few notes, but yeah, they wrote in the margins there. But it's not obnoxious or anything. I can erase those if I want, or if they're interesting, I'll keep them. Now we're on to the last book. And the last book is the only contemporary novel, in the sense that it's from the 20th century. And it's Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston. And this is a book that's really fascinated me. I really wanted to read it for a while. It technically is in the public domain here in Canada, because it was published in the 30s, I believe. And so, yeah, 1937. And it's very short. It's less than 200 pages. But, and I have an e-copy of this, but I cannot bring myself to read the e-copy edition. And for some reason, psychologically, I just have mental breaks in what I want to read on my e-reader versus what I want to read in physical copy. And this is a book that I wanted to get a physical copy of. And I don't know why. I think it's because in my mind I have this idea that the more serious novels that I want to read are best read in a physical copy, and maybe that has something to do with the fact that I like to underline and write notes when I'm seriously grappling with a book. I know that e-reader allows you to underline or to highlight and then write notes that way, but it's just not quite the same experience. And I usually like to use my my e-reader for novels that I wouldn't normally read otherwise, or for non-fiction books. So I like to take more risks with the books that I read on my e-reader. But the books I keep on my physical copy and like to display on my shelves are the books that I want to seriously grapple with a lot more. And then the whole reason why that is a mystery to me, really. I think there's a psychological block between, or different way of my mind conceiving the e-reader versus the physical book. It sees the e-reader more as like a screen. And even though I don't get the same effects of when you're on the screen too much. But anyways, that is the reason why I was very glad to find this novel. It does have a sticker on there. I did not pay that much for it. It says $7. I paid actually a lot less than that. And it's a virtually brand new edition. So I'm glad to have that book. And it's one of the few novels that I ended up purchasing. I think that's one of 3 works of fiction, and then that I bought. So yeah, that's my mail haul, or my book haul, and so I'll leave it at 20 minutes, and I'll see you next time.